I'm John Buchanan. Now, when I'm not making YouTube videos for you guys, you lucky people, I spend most of my life writing production music. And production music is music that goes onto television and radio and trailers and all kinds of places. And effectively, the job of that music is to predict the kind of narrative shapes that might be of value to people making productions of that description. So can you sort of sum up the mood and the feel of what a scene might need? And one thing that I write a fair amount of, like lots of production music composers, is what we refer to as kind of tension underscore. So music that provides this kind of bubbling, evolving collection of sounds that are really good for any scene that's kind of based on movement or is trying to drive tension in some way. And a lot of those tracks, by extension, are then reliant on kind of bass lines, not actually unlike techno in some ways. An idea that we might have something propulsive and deep and interesting. Where am I going with this? Well, the place that I'm going to is that the easiest thing in the world to do is to fire up a preset and play a bass line and sort of hope that that will be enough, that that will capture the ear of an editor and that potentially that will be enough to drive a piece. But I think we need to try a little bit harder than that, because there's a way that we can kind of personalize sounds like that at the heart of our productions to make them more ours, something a bit more interesting. And in this video, what we're going to discover is that we can kind of sequence an approach to parallel distortion, which might make those sorts of patterns quite interesting. Okay, that's a long introduction, lots of words. Let me play you the sound, which is going to be at the kind of core of this little track that I want to put together. It's an alchemy patch, it's up here at the top. It's called Bass Patterns. Perfect. So I've already actually evolved this sound ever so slightly already. I've fired up Logic's AutoFilter, and what I've done is to put in a little bit of envelope shaping. So I've slightly muted the sound by bringing the cutoff frequency down, but what I've done is to open that sound using the envelope shaping, and I've set the threshold at a point where it's detecting the individual slices of this bass, and it's just providing us with a little bit of movement. And that's fine. But it's not really that interesting. What I want to do really is to have a kind of parallel sound which is running alongside this bass line, which is going to enhance it in an interesting way. So the first thing I'm going to do is to configure a kind of distortion for this, which I think is going to give this whole sound a bit more grit and a bit more determination. And I'm going to do that on a parallel channel by setting up a new auxiliary effect. I'm going to select the first one that's available, bus 3, which is here. I'm going to turn up its send level, and over here what I'm going to do is to configure my parallel distortion. Well, there are lots of places I can go. There are lots of distortions within Logic already, but what I'm actually going to do is to start with one of Logic's stomp boxes. So something which was originally designed for pedalboard and long ago. Apple now have made these all individually available as separate stomp boxes too. And in the distortion folder, I'm going to come to Candy Fuzz. And look, there it is. Wonderful little thing. So what I've effectively got is a really straightforward pair of controls. I've got a drive level and, in other words, how much signal I want to send into the fuzz distortion. And I've got an output level controlling the output volume if I find that things are getting out of hand. All by itself, that sounds like this. And instantly the sound has more teeth. Okay, well that's fine, and it certainly sounds exciting for the first couple of bars, but once again, this would become really predictable if all it did was to stay at that level. Fine, drive, attitude, but again, our ears are going to get used to that pretty quickly. Now, one thing I actually want to do is to turn this into something which is more obviously chopped and sequenced, if you like. So in other words, what I want to do is to, rather than have this kind of sustained distortion solution, which is happening right now, I want to punch some holes in that so that effectively this almost tracks the movement of the original bass line in 16th notes. So the next thing I'm going to do is to actually fire up. I'm going to put Candy Fuzz up here for a moment. I'm going to fire up a brand new instrument, and the instrument that I'm going to reach for is one of Logic's absolute classics, which is in the utility folder, and it's Klopfgeist, which normally we don't go anywhere near, but it provides Logic's metronome. This is effectively just a little utility instrument which allows us to play notes which, as you can hear, generate the sort of metronome within Logic. Really simple, very basic little instrument. Now, the reason I like this sound is because it produces this amazingly sharp little transient tick, a bit like a hi-hat, I guess, in terms of the kind of shape of the note. And what I really want to do is to have that sort of style of running 16th notes as a little sidechain source to which we can sort of send that signal into Candy Fuzz in some way to produce something a little bit more sequenced. So what I'm going to need is a series of 16th notes. Well, it's time to play Klopfgeist. Okay, well, felt like that could have gone better. But you know what? I think it's probably fair to say that quantize will be my friend as far as all of that is concerned. And what I really need is for all of these notes to be on just one note. So I'm going to take the lower octave and I'm going to put it up here. And now look, we've got a running series of 16th notes, just like I intended. Let's make them all exactly the same velocity. So I'm going to make them all fixed. And let's make them all the same length as well, just in case that's going to matter. I suspect it won't. And now we really have got a running series of 16th notes. And I want that to play all the way through this pattern. So I'm going to create 4 of them. I'm going to join them together and then I'm going to repeat them again. And we've got a little bit of data that's coming from the way that I've played it, but I'm not too worried about that. Sounds like this. This is going to be the most exciting thing you've ever heard on this channel. Are you ready? That feels strong. Okay, now, as you probably have already predicted, I don't really want to be able to hear this sound. At least, I don't think I do. The interesting thing about sounds like this is that often they do provide quite an interesting little transient top end to bass lines in their own right. Before we completely throw it away, let's see what it sounds like glued to the bass pattern. It does do a thing. It's suddenly providing us with all this kind of front end, which maybe is useful. So actually, I'm not about to do the thing I thought I was about to, which was to turn off the stereo output to this channel. For now, what I'm going to do is to leave it exactly as it is. We might make a decision about that in just a little while. What I am going to do, though, is to come back to my original bass pattern. I'm going to come to the effects that we've set up for Candy Fuzz. And what I'm going to do is to come and find the noise gate. So what the noise gate is going to do is give me an opportunity to gate this signal, to chop it up so that effectively the signal has to exceed a threshold level before we even get to hear it. But rather than just gating it directly, what I'm going to do is to feed our little Klopfgeist instrument, which is going to be here, I think, instrument 2. Yep, sure enough, I should have labeled that. That would have made life a bit easier. But nevertheless, I'm feeding instrument 2 into this noise gate. And effectively, what that's going to mean is that I've got an opportunity to make sure that the gate opens and closes based on the detection of that sound. Now, what I'm going to want is a really fast attack so that the sound speaks immediately. No hold at all. I don't want the signal to stay open for any length of time. And then I'm going to need to set release to whatever sounds right in order to chop this sound up. And actually, for a moment, to really hear this clearly, I am going to turn off the output routing for Klopfgeist just so we can absolutely hear the kind of chopping of this sound really clearly. So threshold is going to be really important, the level above which the signal has to get in order for the gate to open. Let's have a listen. Okay, now that's quite interesting. So if I increase the threshold so much that none of the Klopfgeist signal is loud enough to open the gate, we don't hear the distortion at all because effectively the gate just remains closed. And the other thing which I'm going to just do again is to set that level at a certain point, and I'm going to experiment with the release time. So remember, at really short release times, what that means is that our distortion is going to be literally just chopped up into the short little 16th notes. But at long release times, the gate won't have time to close before the next little bit of signal opens it again, which means that we get this kind of long extended blast of distortion. Have another listen. That would be quite an interesting parameter to automate, wouldn't it? So to record that, what I'm going to do is to select latch mode here for the gated distortion channel, the candy fuzz being fed into the gate. I'm going to come into latch mode here, and what that's going to allow me to do is to record the data for this release parameter, or indeed any other parameter I might be interested in, but this is the one that I'm going to target. So I'm going to just come back to the beginning, and I'm going to start recording some data here, starting with a nice low setting. And that's nice. Now, the moment I press stop, what's going to happen is that the auxiliary for which I have recorded some automation is going to be added to my project. Logic's assuming I might want to edit that data, so it's making it easy for me just to have that be part of the main page. What I need to remember to do is just come back into read mode so I don't inadvertently touch another parameter and potentially record automation data I don't want. So if I press A, what I'm going to see is that down at the bottom here, the release time for the noise gate has been recorded, and there is the crazy pattern that I put in. Okay, so what we've now got is this kind of evolving amount of distortion from a kind of length perspective, how long those distortion blasts last. But what blasts last? That's quite a hard thing to say, but I've said it, so I'm going to move on. So we've got our distortion, which is down here, and that's working nicely, but I want to get it moving too. In other words, just the fact that it's changing in terms of the amount of it that we're hearing isn't enough. What I also want to do is to get it moving in a couple of other ways. So once again, just as I did with the original pattern, what I'm going to do is to come back to the filter, and I'm going to come to the auto filter, and what I'm going to do is to put some LFO movement into the filter, which is coming after the gating. So what this means is the gated signal is about to get filtered. And I'm going to set that across a 2-bar rate. So it's going to evolve up and down using this waveform here. And the LFO amount is going to determine how much we hear of that movement. So I also need to set a basic cutoff amount. And I think it's fair to say that if I solo the distortion gated auxiliary, we'll hear this all by itself. Well, actually, there it is with the bass line. It sounds really good. Let's just see if we can solo just this bus by itself. Okay, so I really like those undulations. I think they're working really nicely, but it would be remiss of me not to try one other thing, which is that the autofilter has a random shape too, and it feels like if I was to clock that to, let's say, 16ths, it would give us an independent little filter setting via the LFO for every single slice of this pattern. What does that sound like? Wow. Okay, so actually what I've done is to take that down to 1/8 notes, just so each blast of that kind of filter information lasts for 2 individual notes. In other words, it's moving every 8th note rather than every 16th. 16th was quite groovy though, wasn't it? It suddenly felt like a totally different piece of music. So we've got a couple of choices here in terms of what we might choose to do. I think I am going to come back to the ramp, although am I going to regret that choice? We'll see. We can always come back to the other one if we want to, but for now I am going to go back to my little 2-bar evolving pattern. Just make sure I've got my envelope setting, my LFO setting correct. Okay, there are a couple more things I want to do. What I'm actually going to do is to EQ this sound. Remember, the original bass line is providing all of the bass that we need, as in I'm talking about the really low bass. So what I'm going to do is to put an EQ on this sound, and I'm just going to roll out the kind of sub-frequencies, sort of below maybe about 120-ish, 130 hertz maybe. So just to get rid of the ultra low bass so that the distortion is focused on slightly higher frequencies. That's the first thing. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put this through Logic's Tremolo plugin, which is, as we've discussed many times on this channel before, oddly named. It should really be called Auto Panner, because that's what it does. It provides side-to-side movement from left to right and back again. And I'm going to set this up over a bar. So effectively, this distortion treatment is going to be moving from left to right. And that's really good. Now I've got the option now to reintroduce my Klopfgeist tick. I'm going to just call that tick. And I'm going to see what it sounds like if I reconnect it to the stereo output. So now here is exactly the same piece, but now with those ticks back in. And then they are through a little bit of reverb. Okay, let's provide some context. I made a couple of other sounds for this track. So a little sequenced line and a little bit of melody just to take us into that kind of tense space that I was talking about. Let's see how all of that feels. And what I'm going to do the second time it plays through is to punch in our gated distortion treatment. Here it is first without it. So at bar 13, I'll punch it in. It's nice. So what we've got here is this kind of sequenced approach. Now, I'm talking about sequencing. What I really mean is something that feels like it's evolving and changing and stepped, but we haven't actually done that with sequencing at all. We've done it by kind of sequencing the effect. We've used a noise gate to chop some holes in this sound. And because that's happening after distortion, it's the distortion that's having those kind of noise punches added to it. But remember, we've also automated the release time so that the predictability of that is decreased. We've added this kind of evolving filter, and what we get now is this kind of new layer, one sound that has been made from another, just there to enhance it and make it a little bit less predictable. And one thing that would be quite interesting would be to put in some dotted patterns rather than just a filter movement that's up and down over 2 bars, so that each time it comes back round, it's in a slightly different place. This kind of processing is really interesting. And remember, we could add it to any other sound within this mix too. I could take my little melody line here, send it across to that auxiliary, and see how the effect of this kind of ticking pattern might sort of sound on a distortion added to other sounds within the mix as well.